Okay, welcome. I have with me Jim Mellon, who is the author of this excellent book here, Moo's Law, which I had the great pleasure of reading over Christmas. Jim, welcome.
Thanks, David.
I'm going to basically cut straight to the meat of it all, and I really want to ask you about you've placed a big bet in the book on cellular meat or alternative proteins, but based on a kind of cellular growth. And I just wanted to come straight in on that and ask you why you think that's so much more interesting as an investment proposition than, say, for instance, the plant-based proteins, Beyond and Impossible, the big brands known in that space. There's a lot of other ones as well. But you in the book, you place a big bet on cellular growth. And also, after that, I'll maybe explain what it actually means. But why do you think cellular is so important?
It's a very good question. So I'm not against the plant-based companies. And in fact, I interviewed Ethan Brown of Beyond for the book, as you know, and a couple of other people, including Morton of Meatless Farms in the UK, and talk about corn and some of the other companies in that area. The problem is that they don't really have the IP that Cell Ag has. They're effectively marketing companies, and so you and I could set up a plant-based protein company tomorrow, call it whatever we want. And we're going to be going up against the big established players like Kellogg's, Unilever, Nestle, who've all got their own brands now. And even some of the supermarkets have their own brands. And McDonald's has brought out McPlant, which is its own brand of plant-based burgers. And it becomes a marketing game, and that's very expensive. And it would be difficult for us to have some defensible IP in. In Cell Ag and all the stuff that we've invested in, there are about 30 investable companies out of 60 that I counted for the book. They all have some form of IP that's defendable over the next 10 years or so to give them a good period of commercial exploitation. And I'll just quickly, because you asked me to give a brief description of what Cell Ag is. So essentially, it's what some people would call lab-grown food and materials. And as I mentioned just now, there are 30 companies that we consider to be investable. Those companies all have prototypes. In other words, this is not science fiction. They are all making foods or materials in laboratories. And essentially what they do is to take stem cells from the relevant animals or fish, or in the case of cotton, and they amplify those and bathe them in nutrients, and then they divide them into whatever components they want, and the components are brought back together and produce meat, fish, or materials. And to give you a very quick example of how that works, you would take a wonderful cow, the best instance of its breed, for instance, the meat you're trying to make. You take a stem cell biopsy from the cow. It doesn't feel anything. It's only 2.5 centiliters. And you amplify its stem cells, and 40 days later, in contrast to a cow, which takes about 28 months to grow to being suitable for meat, you have the equivalent of 7 or 8 cows worth of beef, which is around 3,000 kilos. So that's the trajectory that we're on. And as I said, every one of these companies has a tasting prototype or something that you can feel or touch in the case of materials. And some of them will be on the market within the next year. The seafood companies, particularly Blue Nalu, will be on the market in the United States by the end of this year, so it's really moving very quickly. And Eat Just, which has a chicken lab-grown alternative, is already approved for sale in Singapore, which is a very dynamic area for this Cell Ag stuff. And so we're looking at a fundamental revolution in a very large industry. The beef industry is around the world is equivalent to the size of the economy of Spain. It will be in 20 years' time equivalent to the size of the UK economy. So very big indeed. It's a big prize. And within a few years, we'll reach what is known as griddle, what I've called griddle parity, which is where the prices are equivalent between conventional meat, which has all sorts of negative elements to it, as we know, and lab-grown meat. And indeed, griddle parity has almost been reached by plant-based meats already. So, but conventional meat will be more expensive than lab-grown meat sometime in the next 5 years or so, and hence the great opportunity. No emissions, no animal cruelty, no nothing, and a cheaper price.
Just so I understand, so you do explain in great detail in the book about the technology, but it's important, I suppose, to get your a slightly deeper understanding of technology. So you say you take a stem cell. Now that may raise ethical implications for some people, because of course you are having some animal product there. Even though the animal, as you say, doesn't have to be slaughtered, it could be the best animal, could be the last 250 cows on the planet for grown for agriculture. But nevertheless, you have some animal trace in there. So I imagine that raises a question, maybe come back to that in a second, of an alternative way of getting those specimens. Then you've got, as I understand it, you've got the kind of agents that encourage the growth, yeah, and then you've got the media that allows the expansion. Because I suppose what I was trying to get, I'm not a scientist, so I was trying to get my head around this, is that you're effectively taking a kind of cellular blueprint, which is from the biopsy, and then telling that blueprint to grow at a phenomenal rate over a period of weeks. But therefore, you have to feed it something. I apologize for the simple language, but I'm trying to get my head around it. So you obviously have to feed it, I believe, if I'm right, media to allow the growth to happen. What is that media? I suppose, out of something very small, you end up with something quite large. With animals, we sort of know what it is. We feed them crops, yeah, and we know that the animal grows because it has, in a sense, it's got its coding instructions to grow using the media, which is grass, I suppose. Just what is the media? How do we end up having those many kilograms of cellular grown meat? That's what I'm trying to get my head around. What are the inputs?
Yeah, so obviously this is an industry in evolution. It's not that's something that's static. So what has been produced so far is based on biotech production methods, very expensive.
Yeah.
And the bioreactors, for instance, are the ones that are used in biotech, where the price of the end product is enormous relative to the cost of the inputs. Here, the cost of the inputs will be effectively, in most cases, the price of the end product, which can't be too high because otherwise no one will buy it.
Yeah.
So the scale up is really important, hence the phrase Moore's law, which is a riff off the old Moore's law. So we need bioreactors that are not just 200 liters as they are at the moment, but 20,000 liters and up to 100,000. We also need the price of media to come down, and the media, you're quite right, David, is basically the equivalent that cows would get by eating plant, but getting it in a more direct chemical form. So amino acids, starches, sugars, etc.
Okay.
And those are encouraged, and the cells are encouraged by the use of growth factors. And initially, the growth factors that were used in the production of cell ag meats and seafood were derived from fetal bovine serum, which is exactly what it says. And basically, these are cows going to slaughter which are pregnant, and they take the serum out. It's a pretty gruesome thing, out of the fetus, and they charge a very high price for it. And now every company has moved away from FBS because of exactly the ethical questions that you raise. But there's no getting away, at least at the moment, from the fact that in a non-cruel way, some element of animals will have to be used in the same way that, for instance, we give blood to save fellow human beings. There'll be some element of the animal biology that the animal won't even feel, won't notice that it's being biopsied, and won't be biopsied, 10 times a day, but rather, maybe once every 3 or 4 weeks, to produce the starting mechanism, the stem cells that need to be amplified. So I'm sure that there are extreme vegans out there who will object to that and will not eat even the lab-grown meat. But I think for most vegans, vegetarians, people who are pescatarian or flexitarian, which is an increasing share of the population, this will be absolutely acceptable, providing that it's safe, that it tastes the same, that the texture is the same, and that the price is a reasonable price.
I'll come back to some of the kind of at the end. We'll look at some of maybe the challenges. One observation I'd make: my wife's a vegetarian, and she cares about animal rights. I think are you a vegetarian as well, or a vegan? I can't remember now.
I don't eat meat.
You don't eat meat, okay? I asked her about a lot of this. She said I wouldn't touch it anyway because, to be honest, I don't like the texture of meat. I don't want to taste anything like the texture of meat. So she said I wouldn't really be interested in it. And I've always felt, and I do eat meat, I'm interested in this product because many of the reasons that you said. So I always thought that probably the biggest market for this is probably not your hardcore vegans or hardcore vegetarians, but it's probably just mainstream consumers like me who probably just think, well, I'd rather not have cheap mass-produced mince, beef mince, or cheap mass-produced chicken. I'd rather have something which didn't have all the connotations. So I take on board your points there. I want to come back to the point about scale. You mentioned about the bioreactors, these kind of steel containers that sit in laboratory-like conditions or in laboratories, sort of borrowed from the biotech industry, and the ability to scale up. At what point do you think we're going to get? I think you probably already suggested this with fish, but in beef particularly, or let's say red meat products, so beef and pork. What point do you think we're going to be able to get to sufficient scale that we're going to see it in a supermarket shelf? So I went down to my local Costco, and Beyond, I think Beyond is already there. So plant-based protein is already sitting in a Costco. We've got corn sitting in most supermarkets. When do you think that we'll have cellular products at scale in a supermarket near us?
Well, that's another great question. Well, realistically, the first products that will be on the market will be seafood products.
Yeah.
And they'll be on by the end of this year.
Okay.
And that is because the regulatory authorities in the United States co-regulate the beef industry and the meat industry. So that's the USDA and the FDA. But seafood is only regulated by the FDA. And so Blue Nalu, which is the leader in this area, has already got, you can eat its fish, and it'll be on the market, we think, by the end of this year. And I imagine in the UK that would be a year or so after the United States, which is, apart from smaller countries like Singapore or maybe some of the Middle Eastern countries which are going to authorize this stuff faster, the US is way ahead of the curve in almost every part of this in this area. So, and as far as meat is concerned, we would not think that this stuff will be at scale for another 2 or 3 years. So it's some way away. The company, as you know, David, there's not much money that's gone into this yet. There's a huge amount that's going to come in, but last year, the end of last year, was about $400 million had gone in, of which a good amount had come from us. So it's not as yet a big money area, but it will be, because once you start building the bioreactors and once you start having to scale up, they're going to need very large amounts of capital. We think that it will cost, by the way, about $100 million US to produce enough protein, meat equivalent protein, for about 70,000 people for 20-something years. That's the kind of cost of establishing the factories around the world.
I imagine Elon Musk must be looking at that and thinking what he does with Mars then when he gets his.
I hope not, because he should leave some stuff to other people. He can't have all the money in the world.
Anyway, I want to pick up on fish, because again, reading your book, the one thing that really struck with me is fish, because I have a particular beef. The fishing is absolutely, a lot of fishing is disastrous, particularly industrial trawling. For the kind of the oceans, what was very interesting there is I think the challenges around fish, funnily enough, from a consumer preference point, might be less than with red meat. And I'll come back to the point. A lot of people like me who do eat red meat, I would take convincing to switch out of a steak from an organic steak from a farm that I knew to a cellular steak. funny enough, partly because driven by taste and texture. And I know people are working on things like 3D printing and scaffolding to make sure you've got the texture of the beef right so that the steak's right. I'm not 100% convinced by that. But fish, now that's a slightly different proposition. Of course, fish has texture. Each of the individual varieties of fish that we eat have their own different texture and taste. But I suspect actually an awful lot of consumers will understand that there are a lot of very egregious fishing practices out there, and that actually you probably can get quite close to the texture and feel of fish. A lot of fish, particularly white fish, also maybe tuna. I have doubts about salmon, but we'll come back to that. So, do you think that there's actually a bigger market for fish for the next 5 to 10 years than there is in red meat?
I wouldn't say so, but I think fish will be it's a very good point you make. The thing about fish is that lobby is not as strong as it is with like the Cattlemen's Association of the United States or the beef farmers of Europe.
Yeah.
So it's easier to get fish products that are cell derived on the market.
Yeah.
The second thing is that you're absolutely right. Not only are the oceans being despoiled by current fishing practices, and many types of fish are being fished to extinction. And so McDonald's, for instance, has run through 6 different species since it started with its fillet of fish. But you also have microplastics, mercury in wild-caught fish, which is about half of all the fish. And then in farmed fish, which is, people actually saw what these fish farms are like. A lot of them are like, they wouldn't eat it. Full of antibiotics, hormones, densely packed, and actually by evolutionary drift, genetically modified from their wild-caught compatriots. And furthermore, in the case of salmon, quite often fed by wild-caught fish. So in other words, they grind up the fish they catch in the ocean and feed it to the farm fish. It's a pretty disgusting industry. And so you're right. And I think that many people will be more receptive to eating cell ag fish as a result. However, in terms of meat, what I would say is that in the United States, 60% of meat, and in the UK, 50% of meat is ground. It's mince, it's burgers, it's stuff that goes into sausages, etc. It's not a steak. It's not like the organic steak that you buy down the road. It's a gloop that people use to eat. And I think that that is the first market these meat companies are going after. They're not going after, I mean, there are, Aleph farms in Israel trying to produce lab-grown steaks. I think that's a level of complication that's going to take time to resolve. But making the burger patties from cell ag products like Mosa Meat or Meatable are making is not going to be such a challenge. And I think that once people start eating these, especially if the price is lower and they know they're not getting antibiotics and bad stuff in there, they'll eat the ground beef. So I wouldn't say necessarily it's going to be fish is the only thing. I think in the next few years, you'll also see ground beef becoming a factor in this market.
100% agree. And in fact, one of the most interesting things I was reading recently, there's quite a few investments have gone into things like companies doing alternative protein, fish chowder, shrimp. And there, I mean, I can't really imagine lots of people going, I must have that fish chowder from that dreadful farm in the in the delta around China. I could see that exactly your point around kind of the equivalent of minced beef being a quick, straight move over into alternative proteins. And therefore, can I also question? I think you're probably going to say yes with me. The steak argument, you could push it out to things like I saw one company doing Iberico Jamon and all this kind of stuff. And look, that's a great idea. I like my ham on as much as the next person is, but I just think that the complexity of a lot of the meat-based products is just too difficult for the short to medium term, and that most of the action is going to happen effectively in ground down components. That's effectively what we're talking about here. Is that where you think the action is?
Yes, I do. I mean, there's a company called Vow in Australia which is making kangaroo meat. There's companies that are in a piece of meat in Belgium trying to produce foie gras.
Yeah.
I think they're all too exotic. And foie gras is a big market, and it's a disgusting way in which it's produced. Yeah. But I just think it's too niche. I mean, the market opportunity is $1.5 trillion US around the world for mass-produced meat. why not go after that market? And I think that's going to be the big prize. And in terms of fish, you're looking at a market that's, close to $1 trillion potentially. It's hard to, it's not easy to quantify fish as it is with meat, but nonetheless, it's a very big market to go after, particularly in countries which have a predilectum for fish, like for instance Japan.
Yeah.
And so tuna grown in labs, I think, is going to be a very big deal indeed.
Yeah. Just one other before we just move on to the investment side of it. What about hybrid structures? So I was struck. I was reading your book, and again, I've been reading around a lot of the trade press. And there's a few people playing around with alternative oils and alternative fat and ingredients. And one could imagine an intermediate hybrid step whereby you use plant-based proteins. Now, our friends of mine, I've not actually tried any of them, will quite often say, yeah, they taste sort of near beef, yeah, if you have a beef burger, for instance, but they're not quite there yet. Yeah, and I particularly heard that with bacon, actually, and pork-based products. But you could imagine a hybrid structure whereby you're using cellular-grown oil and other forms of ingredients that you add to the plant-based proteins to effectively, so that the plant-based proteins provide, in a sense, the bulk, but the tasting is provided by the cellular ag. Would that hybrid structure ever work in the market, do you think?
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, there are two types of hybrid. There's the cell ag mixed with plants.
Yeah.
It seems fine to me. And then there's the stuff that Cargill and Tyson are trying to churn out, which is plant-based foods mixed with conventional meat.
Yeah.
To create a hybrid product.
Yeah.
To me, that is just disguising, animals' products in a very underhand way. So I wouldn't go for that. But I would say that the hybrid that you just described is probably going to be a big part of the market, because the cell ag stuff will still be expensive relative to the plant-based stuff for some time to come. So, mixing the two is a way of, first of all, introducing consumers to it, and secondly, creating something that's a balanced nutritional product.
Which leads us nicely. So, in a sense, you could call the companies doing kind of ingredients, fat-based substitutes, and other things, oil-based substitutes, as providing the kind of picks and shovels in many respects of the industry. And we know that from other gold rushes, that it's the picks and shovels people who quite often do very well. And that's an interesting area. You talk about it in the book. Talk us through. So who are the kind of people? There's obviously the problem, I suppose, that cellular ag has got two challenges. It's got challenge A, which is it's got to basically get the price point right. And then B, once it's got the price point right, it's got to build a brand. It's still got to get out to market. The picks and shovels guys don't necessarily have all the same problems. So what do you think from an investment point of view about the picks and shovels space? Who's interesting there? I mean, should we all be going out and buying, what is it, Thermo Fisher Scientific, people who do all the laboratory equipment, or presumably there are more focused niche players than that?
Yeah, so Thermo Fisher is owned by Sartorius, I believe, in Germany, and you can buy shares in that. But most of these companies are heavily diluted in terms of their exposure to food by their principal exposure to biotech, which is their main source of revenue. It doesn't mean that food won't become an important component. They're also highly rated, so in theory, David, I completely agree. Picks and shovels, great. And we are looking at companies, for instance, that are making growth factors much more cheaply. We're looking at companies that can make sensors more cheaply, and lowering the cost of production. And that absolutely is a strategy of agronomics and its firmament. But then you mentioned components as well. And so Geltor, which is a company that was recently quite well funded, making collagen and gelatin substitutes. Gelatin's used widely in the food industry. It comes from cadaver animals. That is a very interesting space. Companies that are making components for the food service industry, including whey and casein from dairy products like Perfect Day in the United States, very interesting. And so there are lots of areas of potential commercial exploitation that we can address. There is also the subject of white space. So, agronomics itself, rather like we've done with our biotech companies, including Juvenescence, is looking at backing scientists, entrepreneurs to create companies in which it has not just 5 or 10%, but maybe 50% of a company in an area that's not yet being exploited. And that, we hope, will add some luster to agronomics. And we're also looking at doing licensing deals between companies situated in the US that haven't got a clue about overseas markets, and acting as their middleman agent for markets of, for instance, in the Middle East, which is where I am at the moment, because countries that are food insecure, all of them in the Middle East, or countries like Singapore or Hong Kong, are ideal places to, first of all, accelerate the process of regulation, and secondly, to build the lab-grown structures so that they can be more self-sufficient in food. So there's lots of white space and opportunity in this area, but the problem is that the companies that currently have, that make the nutrients, the media, growth factors and so forth, are already large companies in the biotech sector, which you're basically buying a whole load of other business apart from the very small business that's represented by food at the moment.
Now, you just mentioned agronomics. I was going to come on to that. So agronomics is a London-listed investment fund. I think it's probably designated as investment fund. And I think I bumped into, there's a Canadian outfit I think might be out there, but you're basically the biggest by a long stretch, and certainly one of the most successful in the share price term. The share price has moved up quite swiftly as we're speaking. Just talk us through the agronomics model. Now, you're effectively a kind of listed venture capitalist in this space, from what I can work out. You have a portfolio with investments that includes Blue Nalu. Do you want to just talk us through what the modus operandi of that fund is?
Yeah, great question. So the agronomics started off as being a vehicle for people to access the seed rounds and the Series A's, because there haven't been Series B's yet in this area, as well as to invest in some of the plant-based stuff. So it has a big position in Live Kindly, which is likely to go public very soon, as an example. So it's not just Cell Ag, but largely Cell Ag with some plant-based stuff attached to it. But it's evolving into more than just a portfolio of positions of 5% or so in these companies. As I understand it, I know it's got 14 companies in the portfolio out of the 30 investable ones. It's also looking at, as I mentioned earlier, the white spaces that it can back itself. So agronomics itself will be the progenitor and the owner of, or the substantial owner of these companies, and also doing licensing deals which agronomics would benefit from in the areas that are food insecure and where the largely American companies don't really know how to operate. Agronomics covers food, including meat and seafood. It also covers materials. So it's got an investment in vitro labs, which is super promising and produces leather in a lab from cow stem cells. That's a fantastic business. And already they're getting very close to the price of conventionally produced luxury leather. And already they have commercial contracts. And then cotton, which is very destructive to the environment, as indeed is all this stuff, and where you can basically produce cotton, theoretically at least, 1/6 the price with very little environmental damage compared to the current methods of production of cotton. It also has a British company, quite a big investment in Tropic, which is using gene editing techniques to make plants more resilient. It's a world leader in that area. And so it's got a fairly broad portfolio. So it was set up, it was a London shell company. I'm the biggest shareholder, and then the most recent round I put in the largest amount of money. I'm a real big believer in this area. It doesn't have a management fee, it has a performance fee, which is kind of back-ended, but not egregious. And it's about $100 million in size at the moment, and our objective is to make it $500 million by the end of this year, which I think we can do through a process of NAV accretion and also the money that sitting on the sidelines that wants to come into this area is enormous. But as you rightly point out, there's a vegan ETF in the US that, as far as I can see, just invests in Facebook and Google, which I don't know what they have to do with veganism. And then there's a couple of Mickey Mouse companies, but there's nothing listed yet. So it's a very good way for investors to participate in these companies, because most of them are just going to stay. I think a lot of them will stay private. I mean, I think the whole industry will evolve as follows. I put it in my book that companies are going to fold, as they always do in new areas. Most of them will be sold. I think that the big food companies will buy them for their technology. So rather like biotech companies are bought by big pharma companies so that they act as the marketing agents for their innovative products, and it'll be the same with this. And there'll be one or two that will plow their own furrow. So if I had to guess, I would say that in 10 years' time, agronomics won't exist. It will have paid back, its profits to shareholders and distributed any of the companies that go forward as large companies to the shareholders by way of a specie distribution. And then obviously there'll be a few that will have gone bust in the portfolio, because that's the way of the world. But overall, I think this industry could be very large indeed. And at the moment, it's just, as I said, $400 million has gone in. I expect it to be well over $1 billion of fresh capital this year, probably a lot more. So the money is, as with everything else, is beginning to follow the trend of consumers wanting to eat cleanly and healthily. And let's face it, all pandemics, all of them, have come from food malpractice, largely in the Far East.
Just as we finish up, a couple of last questions. As an investor in this space, obviously you can invest in agronomics, but there will be other companies that list. I think I've got a little database I've been building, and there's a few companies out there on this radio exchange. There's not a lot out there. For an investor looking to invest in this space, obviously agronomics would be the perfect vehicle. But what would be your warnings about how you need to navigate around this space? Because you said the companies are going to go bust. So what are the things where you, as somebody invests in this space, you go, well, there's kind of warning signs around that. What would you be careful about?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned to you, David, I think the exotic stuff I would just leave to one side. Yeah. Because it may be that one or two of them will succeed, but there's no point in taking that unnecessary layer of risk. Yeah. The second is look for the veteran management teams. I mean, as an example, Memphis Meats in the US has a very strong management team. And you've got Blue Nalu, very strong management team, and we like Mosa and Meatable as well. All of these companies are as yet not planning to list. You'll get more plant-based ones listing quite soon, I think. Live Kindly is an excellent company, by the way, and I think they're going to list at maybe even 5 billion euros. I don't know for sure, but that's the kind of the talk around the town. So I go for the more veteran teams that have food experience, that have some biotech experience, and that have a working product rather than something that's science fiction on the bench, basically. Yep. We like Solar from Finland, which is producing proteins effectively out of thin air using hydrogenotropes, and then also electrolysis. And there's another company in the US which looks appealing as well, called Air Protein, in the same area. I would look for a sort of balanced approach in this area. But the great news is there aren't that many of them. And so in the book, all proceeds to the Good Food Institute, which is the leading advocacy group in this area, fantastic organization. You'll find a list of all the companies, and then not recommendations, but descriptions of the ones that we like more than the others. So hopefully people will pick up the book and have a look at that. And also the website for the book and for agronomics contains up-to-date information on the industry. It's a very fast-moving industry. This is going to move much faster than the typical biotech industry, because it doesn't have to go through 10 years of trials and billions of dollars of research. You'll see pretty high sales, I would think, in the next 5 years. Rethink X, the UK consultancy, thinks that half of the conventional meat industry will be gone by the year 2030, which is only 9 years away, as we know. And so this is very rapidly moving. And I always tell people that if you don't believe that trajectory, then just look at what's happened to conventional milk production in the United States. It's alternative milks, soya, rice, oat, etc., have gone from 0.5% of the market in the US 10 years ago to 20% today, and they're all plant-based. When the cell ag milks, which are identical to the real thing but without cows being involved, come on the market, that's going to be really exciting. And we actually have a company called Legendary that's involved in that in our portfolio, agronomics.
One last question, actually just related back to the kind of listed company thing. One of the companies that's sort of connected to this space that did emerge on the market in November was a company called Novus Capital, which is kind of which speaks to the ag tech revolution, which you with Tropic have a connection to, but there's a bigger ag tech revolution kicking off as well. And as you said, agriculture and farming will be revolutionised come what may. What do you make of the ag tech revolution? So, for instance, particularly Novus, which is a SPAC vehicle, has got a business called App Harvest being backed into it, and we're due to have a chat to them. But from what we can work out, effectively, you've got next generation greenhouses banging up against vertical farming. How do you get the intensity of farming increased? What do you make of that kind of vertical farming, next gen greenhouses? But more generally, the ag tech space, because again, there might well be quite a lot of businesses popping up in that space.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I cover it in the book, but I say that it's a very capital-intensive business, and so far, vertical farms haven't made any money for anyone, apart from if you float them on the stock market. So it's not an area that we're involved in. The other thing about vertical farming is that you need very high cash crop prices to make it work. So it's limited to a few types of crops. But there's a German company out there which is now putting vertical farms, mini vertical farms, into supermarkets. I think they're going to be putting them into UK supermarkets as well. So maybe the idea of picking your fresh produce while you walk around the supermarket will be appealing to consumers. But let's face it, that the supply chain of vegetables, fruit and vegetables, etc., is pretty well established. As far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of cruelty involved in the process. So of course, the carbon footprint's not great because of the distance that this stuff has to travel. But it's completely different to the intensively farmed meat industry, which accounts for 1/5 of all global emissions, water misuse, land despoilation, particularly in the Amazon rainforest, very inefficient way of converting crops into protein, animal protein, and has almost everything negative attached to it, including antibiotics, hormones, etc., which can lead to massive pandemic risk. It's not the same in the farming of fruit and vegetables, so it's not an area that's directly appealing to us at the moment, at least.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jim. So that's Jim Mellon, two guys' book, Moo's Law. Have a look at agronomics. Jim, thank you very much for giving us some time.
Thanks,
and hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Look forward to seeing you. Bye-bye. Bye.